German immigrants came in 1685 and founded Germantown, which is today a part of Philadelphia. The United States, especially the colony of Pennsylvania, offered freedom of religion.
The first Germans immigrated to the USA almost 4 centuries ago. But over the years, how have they managed to gain so much influence in the country? Astonishingly, there is a state in the US which is known as the German state, primarily because of its strong and unbreakable connections with Germans and their culture. But it wasn't just about America giving Germans refuge in a time of need. The reason behind the existence of this state is a complex one. So, join us as we dive into the reasons why there is a German federal state in the USA. The beginnings of German settlements. Germans who settled in America were quite a mixed bunch. They brought along their diverse religious and cultural values, which sometimes clashed with the prevailing Yankee way of doing things. For instance, while the Yankees were all about banning beer and pushing for temperance, the German Lutherans and Catholics weren't on board with that at all. They preferred a more traditional paternalistic family structure, where the husband had the final say in public matters. Also, most of them were against women's suffrage. Ironically, during World War I, this anti-suffrage stance was flipped around to argue in favor of giving women the vote, especially when German Americans found themselves out of favor. On the flip side, there were German Protestant groups like the Methodists and United Brethren who had roots in European pietism. These folks were more aligned with Yankee moralism, which made them a bit of an exception among German settlers. The first Germans to arrive in America came with the English settlers to Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. They also had physicians and botanists among them, and one of them was Johannes Fleischer. He was quickly followed a year later by a group of glassmakers and carpenters. In 1683, Germantown was formed in Pennsylvania. This was the first time that the Germans permanently settled in America. Germans immigrated en masse in the late 1600s and early 1700s, particularly to Pennsylvania. They were attracted to America by the idea of improving their economic situation and getting a chance to practice religion freely, avoiding failure of farming back home, religious intolerance, and forced enlistment. Some bought their passage by agreeing to work as indentured servants for several years. The major regions where Germans settled were places like Pennsylvania, upstate New York, and the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. Many of these settlers were Lutheran or German Reformed churches. And there were also other groups such as Moravians and Mennonites. The arrival of German Catholics in the United States did not begin until after the War of 1812. One of these was the Palatine migration in the year 1709. The subjects were the Protestant Germans from the Palatine region, who, due to poverty and war, wanted to flee to Rotterdam, then to London, and only with Queen Anne's aid, they reached the colonies of America. Conditions were exhausting due to sickness, such as typhus, and lack of food and water along the trail. Among the 2,100 migrants that were taken, a majority of them died, while those who survived settled in what is now known as the Hudson River. The Palatine Germans, who arrived in this region during the middle of the 17th century, had established rich settlements in the Mohawk Valley by the middle of the 18th century, cultivating productive farms and constructing houses, and were able to survive even if there were tensions with the indigenous people. They continued to speak the German language and practice their German traditions. One of them was John Peter Zenger, who went on to become a freedom of speech advocate in colonial New York. Settlements in the U.S. states. Another significant wave of German settlers arrived in Louisiana in the early 1700s, organized by John Law. Despite harsh conditions and high mortality rates, the survivors established the German coast along the Mississippi River, providing New Orleans with essential supplies like corn, rice, eggs, and meat for many years. In the southeastern U.S., German settlers founded Germana in Virginia, thanks to Lieutenant Governor Alexander Spotswood's efforts. He advertised in Germany for miners and laborers, encouraging them to settle in Virginia to develop the local mining industry. This led to the establishment of German communities in the Piedmont and Shenandoah Valley. North Carolina also saw German settlements, particularly by Moravians who traveled from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. They purchased land and founded communities like Bethabara and Salem, which later became part of Winston-Salem. In Georgia, German settlers were recruited by James Oglethorpe, establishing communities in Savannah and other areas in the 1730s and 1740s. They brought improved farming techniques and were known for their construction skills and joint religious services. The Germans also left their mark in New England, particularly in Maine. Despite initial hardships and conflicts with Native Americans, they adapted by turning to the shipping and fishing industries. Pennsylvania, however, remained a major hub for German immigrants. By the mid-1700s, Germans made up about one-third of the population. They were known for their productive farming practices and initially avoided political involvement. However, by 1740, they allied with Quakers to gain political power and later supported the American Revolution. The term Pennsylvania Dutch refers to these German settlers, with Dutch originating from the German word Deutsch. They created a rich cultural and religious life, contributing significantly to American society. How the Germans were dispersed in the American states. According to the 1790 census, the highest density of Germans was in Pennsylvania. There were 140,983 of them, and made up 33.3% of the state's population, with rural, low-income women and children as their primary beneficiaries. Other large groups were those in Maryland, with 24,412 people, comprising 11.7% of the population, New York, with 25,578 people comprising 8.2% of the population, and New Jersey, with 15,636 people comprising 9.2% of the population. In total, Germans constituted about 8.65% of the U.S. population at that time. There was another anti-tax revolution of Germans in Pennsylvania in 1799-1800 called Friese's Rebellion. It was one of the earliest and most short-lived movements begun by Germans in America, but it showed their political standing in the area. The immigration of Germans to the United States was greatly observed between the year 1820 and the First World War, whereby around 6 million Germans immigrated to the country. They were the biggest stream of immigrants between 1840 and 1880. After the revolution in the German states in the year 1848, many revolutionaries, who were also called 48ers, immigrated to America. Some of them were professionals, journalists, and politicians such as Carl Schurz and Henry Villard. The Germans were among the first immigrants, and they set up the German communities in many of the states, with a higher percentage of the settler population in the Midwest region. The United States cities like Milwaukee, Cincinnati, St. Louis, and Chicago are the best-known cities where the majority of the Germans settled. German Americans were a significant part of the population of many cities. For instance, by 1900, Cleveland, Milwaukee, and Cincinnati had populations of German Americans more than 40%. In some places like Omaha, Nebraska, the German Americans comprised 57% of the total population by the year 1910. These communities generally assumed unique names based on their background, for example, Over the Rhine in Cincinnati and German Village in Columbus, Ohio. Milwaukee was even known as the German Athens because of its heavy German presence, especially in the political realms and brewing sector, which produced beer brands like Pabst, Schlitz, Miller, and Blatz. German Jews started arriving in significant numbers after 1820, spreading across the North and South, and even to California, where Levi Strauss arrived in 1853. They formed small German Jewish communities in various cities, typically working as merchants, bankers, and local business operators. Prominent examples include Henry Lehman, founder of Lehman Brothers. They also established Reform synagogues and numerous philanthropic organizations, distinguishing themselves from the later wave of Yiddish-speaking East European Jews. The port cities of New York City and Baltimore had large German populations, as did Hoboken, New Jersey. These cities became important centers for German-American culture and business. In the Midwest, German immigrants were drawn to cities along the Great Lakes, the Ohio River, and the Mississippi and Missouri rivers. They established significant communities in cities like Milwaukee, Cincinnati, St. Louis, and Chicago. By 1850, Ann Arbor, Michigan, had around 5,000 Germans, mostly Swabians. Texas also attracted many German immigrants who entered through Galveston and Indianola. They established farms and later took industrial jobs in cities like Houston, where they built a robust brewing industry. By the 1850s, Texas had about 20,000 German Americans, representing a diverse cross-section of German society, from peasant farmers to intellectuals. Germans from Russia, who had lived for generations along the Volga River and near the Crimea, began emigrating to the United States in the late 19th century. They settled primarily in the Dakotas, Kansas, and Nebraska. These Germans maintained tight-knit communities, preserving their language and culture. How the Civil War changed things. When it comes to the American Civil War, German Americans were predominantly anti-slavery, especially those known as the 48ers. One of the most vocal figures among them was Herman Raster, who fervently opposed slavery and was a strong supporter of Abraham Lincoln. During the Civil War, hundreds of thousands of German Americans volunteered to fight for the Union. They were the largest immigrant group to participate, with over 176,000 U.S. soldiers born in Germany. One of the most popular Union commanders among the Germans was Major General Franz Sigel. Many German immigrants enlisted with the intention to fight MIT Sigel, making him a key figure for German-American soldiers. Despite only 1 in 4 Germans fighting in all German regiments, these regiments created the public image of the German soldier. States like Pennsylvania fielded 5 German regiments, New York 11, and Ohio 6. As for the farmers, Western railroads, with large land grants, attracted many German farmers. They set up agencies in Hamburg and other German cities, offering cheap transportation and easy terms for buying farmland. The Santa Fe Railroad, for example, hired its own immigration commissioner and sold over 300,000 acres to German-speaking farmers. German Americans were deeply committed to farming and keeping their land within the family. They employed risk-averse strategies and carefully planned inheritances to ensure the land stayed in the family. Their communities typically had smaller average farm sizes, greater equality, less absentee ownership, and greater geographic persistence. Germans from various regions contributed to immigrants, with East Friesland being a notable example. The Ostfriesische Nachrichten connected around 20,000 immigrants from East Friesland across the Midwest to their homeland. The paper, which ran from 1881 to 1971, mixed American and German news, letters, poetry, fiction, and dialogue, allowing immigrants to honor their origins and celebrate their new lives as prosperous farmers. Politically, German Americans were active voters. While relatively few held office, many voted once they became citizens. During the third-party system, 1850s, 1890s, Protestant and Jewish Germans leaned toward the Republican Party, while Catholic Germans were staunch Democrats. Germans strongly opposed prohibition and distrusted moralistic crusaders, often referred to as Puritans. They also opposed free silver and voted against William Jennings Bryan in 1896. However, in 1900, many German Democrats returned to their party and voted for Bryan, likely due to President McKinley's foreign policy. In places like St. Louis, Missouri, German Americans were a political force. They voted overwhelmingly for Lincoln in 1860 and supported the war effort. However, a proposed Missouri state constitution discriminating against Catholics and freethinkers, along with a special loyalty oath for priests and ministers, angered them. This led to significant political shifts, including support for the Liberal Republican Party in 1872. Many Germans in late 19th century cities were involved in the labor union movement, with some being communists or anarchists. For example, 8 of the 42 anarchist defendants in the 1886 Haymarket Affair in Chicago were German. German Americans' participation during the World Wars. Both during the WWI and W2, the German Americans were subjected to a lot of difficulties. During World War I, anything German was viewed negatively as the fight was against the Germans. Theodore Roosevelt, the 26th President of the United States, condemned the dual allegiance, stressing that it was impossible during the war. The Justice Department proceeded to list German aliens, and this led to the imprisonment of many individuals, more than 4,000 in fact. Some of the racial tension manifested in violence, like the lynching of Robert Prager in Illinois. During the Second World War, German Americans also played very important roles, such as General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was the supreme commander in Europe.
We came down here hoping and praying that the weather would be sufficiently good we could go on the June 5th.
And Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, who was the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Ocean areas. Nevertheless, people remained suspicious and discriminated against each other. In the 1940s, the Alien Registration Act forced German-born residents of America to register with the federal government. This led to their movement being restricted, and they were denied the right to own property. Between 1940 and 1948, 11,480 German citizens were interned. After the Second World War, millions of ethnic Germans were sent out of Central and Eastern Europe. Some joined Germany as refugees, while others arrived in the United States. The hatred and animosity towards Germans because of the Second World War had lessened from the year 1970 onwards. Today, Germans are fully integrated into American society. However, they still hold festivals such as Oktoberfest to help remember their roots. How German ancestry grew in America. According to the 1990 U.S. Census, there were 58 million people of German heritage in America, making German Americans one of the largest immigrant groups in the United States. Then, it was reported in 2005 by the American Community Survey that about 50 million Americans have German origin. German Americans on aggregate constituted 17% of the total population of the United States of America and 26% of the non-Hispanic white. Presently, the Germans are fully integrated into the American population, but there are still noticeable communities of German descendants present in Cincinnati, Milwaukee, and St. Louis. Organized events like the German Fests and the Oktoberfests are prevalent in many parts of the United States to show the continued German impact. During the contemporary period, Germans continue to be a vital part of the American population as they preserve their historically rich culture while at the same time assimilating into American society. How the Germans preserved their languages and culture. Germans in America were very keen on keeping their language alive, and they did a fantastic job of it. They set up newspapers and offered German classes in both elementary and high schools. Take Milwaukee, for instance. German Americans there really pushed for education, establishing German language schools and even teacher training seminaries called Tochter Institute. By the late 1800s, they had the Germania Publishing Company cranking out books, magazines, and newspapers all in German. Germania became the go-to term for German American neighborhoods and their organizations, while Deutschtum captured that transplanted sense of German nationalism, both culturally and politically. Between 1875 and 1915, the German-American population in the U.S. doubled, with many insisting on keeping their culture alive. They spoke German in schools and churches and created various Vereine, or clubs, dedicated to literature, humor, gymnastics, and singing. Interestingly, even after the U.S. joined World War I, many German Americans supported anti-draft and anti-war candidates. However, Deutschtum pretty much fell apart after 1918. Music was another big part of German American life. Starting in 1741, the Moravian church settlements in places like Bethlehem, Nazareth, and Lititz, Pennsylvania, as well as Wachovia in North Carolina, developed rich musical cultures. They were big on choral music, brass and string music, and congregational singing. The Moravian Church produced many talented composers and musicians, with Haydn's creation making its American debut in Bethlehem in the early 1800s. Johann Conrad Beissel's spiritual beliefs influenced the music of the Ephrata cloister in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. His treatises on music and hymns are considered the beginnings of America's musical heritage. In most major cities, Germans took the lead in creating vibrant musical cultures, with popular bands, singing societies, operas, and symphonic orchestras. Even in a small city like Wheeling, West Virginia, there were 11 singing societies, which thrived until anti-German sentiments during World War I, and changing social values led to their decline. In Louisville, Kentucky, the Liederkranz Music Society played a vital role in integrating the German community into local life. Founded in 1848, it faced challenges, especially from nativist hostility, organized by the Know Nothing movement. Violent demonstrations forced the society to downplay its performances, but by 1873, they had built a large auditorium and were well accepted in Louisville by 1877. The German imperial government promoted German culture in the U.S., particularly through music. German-born conductors like Arthur Nikisch and Karl Muck helped establish German serious music, such as Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. As a dominant cultural force in the U.S., the Turners, or Turner Societies, emerged in the mid-19th century as social and sports clubs for German-American immigrants. The National Turner Bund even started drilling members like militia units in 1854, with nearly half of all Turners fighting for the Union in the Civil War. By the 1890s, Turners numbered around 65,000. However, by the turn of the 21st century, with changing ethnic identities and Americanization, Turner groups became fewer, with fewer athletic events and more non-German members. The German language press was crucial for German immigrants, helping them stay connected to their heritage while learning about their new home. By the late 1800s, over 800 regular German publications were in circulation. Prominent dailies like the New Yorker Staatszeitung, the Anzeiger des Westens in St. Louis, and the Illinois Staatszeitung in Chicago promoted middle-class values and ethnic loyalty. These papers were American in nature, published in German but independent of German control. They reported on political and diplomatic events involving Germany with pride, but catered to American readers' perspectives. In Cincinnati alone, at least 176 different German-language publications started between 1850 and 1900, though many folded quickly. The surviving ones played a significant role in their communities, especially during challenging times like World War I, when anti-German sentiment and legislation like the Espionage and Sedition Acts authorized censorship of foreign-language newspapers. By 1920, only 278 German-language publications remained. Germans also brought organized gymnastics to America, using sports to promote ethnic identity and aid integration into American society. The Turner movement offered exercise programs and social havens for new immigrants. The Buffalo Germans basketball team, with a record of 762 wins to 85 losses in the early 20th century, exemplified the success of German-American sports programs. Notable figures like Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig, who spoke German at home, showed the strong influence of German Americans in sports. Religious influences brought in by German immigrants. German immigration in the mid to late 19th century brought various religions, with many Lutherans and Catholics among them. Secularism was also present, especially among the 48ers, who rejected formal religion. Around 250,000 German Jews arrived by the 1870s, establishing Reform synagogues. Central and Eastern European Jews, arriving from the 1880s to 1924, brought more traditional practices. Language-wise, German Americans gradually adopted English, though German was widely spoken in neighborhoods and schools until World War I. Anti-German sentiment during the war led to the end of most German language instruction and church services. Today, about 1.5 million Americans speak German at home, reflecting the lasting, though diminished, influence of the German language in the U.S. In the late 19th century, fierce debates arose in Wisconsin and Illinois over using German in schools. The Bennett Law of 1889 in Wisconsin required English for major subjects in all schools, affecting many German-language private schools. This led to a political backlash, with the German community aligning with the Democratic Party to defeat the law. By 1917, most schools taught in English, and German language courses were dropped. Germans and their history with Wisconsin. Wisconsin has some pretty complicated ties with Germans due to the immigration of a large number of Germans to the state in the 1830s and later on. This influence has, over time, become an integral part of Wisconsin's culture and economy, thus making Wisconsin stand out as a unique German destination in the United States. It all started when the first massive immigration of Germans in the United States started around the year 1830. It was founded in 1839 by 300 German Lutherans from Pomerania, who left to escape the Prussian denominational changes and persecution. It was in this city that practicing religion became a freedom to many, and this gave way to even more Germans to immigrate into the country. The political unrest in Germany in 1848, with liberal revolutionaries attempting to install democratic governments and increased civil rights, forced many Germans into emigration, and they arrived in Wisconsin drawn by the tolerant political arrangements and economic stability of the place. Germans were not only attracted to Mormon religious policy, but also cheap land and economic opportunities. It made them quickly establish themselves in the fields of both agricultural as well as industrial professionals and traders of skilled services. The biggest city in Wisconsin, Milwaukee, was transformed into the center of German-American identity and was frequently referred to as the Deutsche Athen, German Athens, due to its marked cultural significance. Within Milwaukee and other regions of Wisconsin, German influence continued through German language schools or colleges, churches, newspapers, and societies. German-speaking cultures and traditions were kept alive through these institutions. After some time, a special dialect, Wisconsin German, appeared, consisting of a variety of German dialects performed by immigrants and English. They also contributed to the development of the economic system of Wisconsin, as many were Germans. In return, their skills involving themselves in trades such as brewing, woodworking, and agriculture were very useful. Local breweries, such as those from Germany brewing their beer in Milwaukee, become the topic of conversation, and staple events like Oktoberfest in the state's calendar. Because of these reasons, more German businesses were created, and the Wisconsin economy, which was closely linked with Germany, had a positive growth. The two world wars especially had a big influence on the mobilization of German-American communities, most of which were found in Wisconsin. In these periods, the resentment towards the Germans resulted in the reduction of the use of the German language, as well as the eradication of German cultural aspects. However, this did not suppress the German roots in Wisconsin, as it remained an influential part of the area's tradition. Until the 50s, there was more or less a decline in Germanic culture and its manifestation. However, towards the next half of the 20th century, this began to change. This just meant a lot of the traditional foods, fests, and companies that were connected to Germanic origins came back, which meant that the pride of being of German origin was revived. Nowadays, the jubilant Wisconsin boasts its German roots. Many festivals that started in the state have a German flair to them, and the state is host to many breweries and restaurants with German influence. Local and traditional food consumed includes bratwurst, schnitzel, and pretzels. The common cultural event, Oktoberfest, is held annually in Milwaukee, and many people come from various parts of the globe to embrace the intense German culture. And of course, you can also notice the German influence in Wisconsin regarding the architecture of the buildings. It is possible to note the presence of peculiar German motifs in many buildings and areas. Towns such as Germantown and New Glarus are almost exactly like the original towns of Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. Though the German language is not so prevalent now, it is taught in schools, and some communities still continue to speak the linguistic heritage language. Even today, it is said that Wisconsin is the German state within the U.S., proving the extent of the influence that German immigrants had within the state. They have brought into the state culture, economy, and a social structure that reflects both American and German customs and norms. This cultural heritage is still being cherished and continues to be promoted to date. It also makes Wisconsin one of the most interesting case studies of how immigration can change the face of American society.